Who are you? If somebody asks us that question, we answer, if we have the time, in terms of a story. A story of where we've come from, where we are going. This is where I was born. This is the school I went to. This is the job I do. This is my spouse. We each have a unique story to tell. And if we are not able to tell our lives in terms of a story, a meaningful, coherent account, then we go through an emotional crisis, a crisis of identity. Now, the God that we worship is also identified by a story. God has a story. A story that begins with the calling of Abraham, but has its climax, its focus, in the story of Jesus of Nazareth, his life, his death, his resurrection. The story of Jesus is the definitive story of God himself. Now, we as a church need to learn to tell each other our stories, not only to get to know each other deeply, but to tell each other our stories in such a way that they intersect with God's story, to help each other locate or situate our stories within the bigger story of God himself. That is how we grow up as Christians. We grow as a church. And as we help each other see our personal stories in the light of God's bigger story, we may come to realize that the events and relationships that we thought were important and significant in our telling of our story may not be that important or significant after all. Now, I'll come back to this later on during this sermon, but I want you now to turn to that gospel reading for today from St. John's Gospel, chapter 12. I notice we have some new Bibles in the church pews. Wonderful. These are not there for show. They've been gifted to us by Krishanti Emmanuel's family so that we can actually open these Bibles and follow the sermon for ourselves. So please turn to John chapter 12, verse 20 onwards. Here are some Greeks who've come to the Jewish Passover festival. There were many Greeks who were attracted to Jewish worship, but were not yet Jewish proselytes or converts themselves. And some of these Greeks come to Philip and they seek an interview with Jesus. They say, "We want to see Jesus." And Jesus seems to turn his back on them. Instead of granting them an interview, he sees their coming as symbolic, that now the time has come, the hour has arrived for me, the Messiah, the Son of Man, to be glorified. Verse 23. And Jesus connects his glorification with his crucifixion. I, when I'm lifted up from the earth, lifted up on the cross, will draw all people to myself. Jesus seems to be saying, well, there's no point talking to the Greeks now, they'll never understand me. There's no place for me in Greek philosophy, just as there is no place for me in Buddhist philosophy. These philosophies cannot contain me. They cannot make sense of me. It's only on the other side of the cross, when the story is more complete, that my identity will be revealed. Because on the other side of the cross, I will bring about a new humanity, a multinational people of God, comprising Jew and Greek and Indians and Chinese, united under my liberating, gracious rule. This is a new creation, and it can only come about through death, which is nonsense to Greek philosophy or to Buddhist philosophy. And so he says in verse 24, unless a grain of wheat, or rice in our context perhaps, falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone, a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Just think of a grain of rice or wheat that falls into the earth and is buried. It disappears from view. Nothing seems to be happening for many months, but when it eventually emerges, yielding a harvest of wheat or rice, it has been changed beyond recognition. And Jesus is saying, that is my mission. I will emerge on the other side of the cross with a glorified, resurrected body, which is the prototype or the beginning of a new creation. And along with me, a new humanity, a redeemed, reconciled humanity, a foretaste of a new world that is to come. And then he goes on in the very next verse, verse 25, to say, those who love their life will lose it. Those who hate their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Now, this loving and hating is a Hebrew way of placing emphasis. Jesus often used exaggeration, or what we call hyperbole, in saying things like, well, unless you hate your wife or husband or your children or your parents, you cannot belong to me. Now, of course, if we hate our lives and hate everything and every other person around us, we are psychologically damaged people. Jesus is not calling us to be psychologically damaged, but he's saying, compared to your love for me and for the one whom I call my Father, your love for everybody else and anything else must be considered hatred. So this is about a certain attitude, a certain orientation towards life, that we see our lives not as our possession, but we see our lives and all the gifts that come with life, intellectual gifts, artistic gifts, musical gifts, material gifts, families. We see these as entrusted to us by God, to be used not for our self-advancement, our self-fulfillment, let alone our self-preservation, but rather to do God's purposes in God's world. We exist for God, not for ourselves, not for our spouses, not for our children. We exist for God. Now, this mystery of a God who freely embraces suffering in Christ, who bears the shame and the sin and the guilt of the world, this is a picture of God, a story of God, that runs counter to all the stories of God that you will find in the religious traditions of humankind. It's deeply offensive. It was deeply offensive to the Jews of his time to speak of a God who suffers. It is deeply offensive to the Muslim mind today. Muslims see this as compromising the transcendence and the sovereignty of God. God is all-powerful. God does whatever he wills in the world. How can you speak of a God who is crucified as a powerless victim at the hands of human powers? What kind of God is this? And this picture of the weak, vulnerable, powerless God challenges all those pictures and stories of God that we find in the religions of the world. And it forced the early disciples of Jesus to radically rethink their concept of God, their picture of God in the light of the story of Jesus, the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. They had to radically rethink about power and the way that God's power actually works in the world. And that is how the doctrine of the Trinity emerged in the Christian church. But that's another story, another sermon. Now, how are we as Christians, as the Church of Jesus Christ, to tell this story, to bear witness to this story, to speak of this kind of God? Well, Jesus goes on to say in verse 26, whoever serves me, that is, whoever wants to be my disciple, must follow me, and where I am, there will my servant be also. You want to be where Jesus is? I mean, so many of the songs we sing are about being in the presence of Jesus. We want to be where Jesus is. But where does Jesus say he is? He's about to be dragged outside the city walls, and he's going to be put up on a Roman gallows. And he's saying, if you want to be with me, come and join me. Come and experience the shame, the rejection, the abandonment, the loneliness, the suffering, the torture, the death. Because where I am, there I expect my church, my disciples, my followers to also be. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a well-known German pastor. He was serving in a church and a theological seminary in New York in the 1930s, and he went back against the advice of a lot of his friends back to Nazi Germany to live under the Nazi tyranny. In the closing years of the war, he joined a plot to assassinate Hitler, a plot that was unsuccessful. He was arrested, imprisoned, he was put to death in April 1945. Some of Bonhoeffer's deepest, most profound meditations on the Christian life come out of his 2 years in prison. And in one of his letters from prison, he says these words, "To be a Christian does not mean to be religious in a particular way, to cultivate some particular form of asceticism or penitence. It is simply to be a man, or we would say a man or a woman." He goes on, "It is not some religious act which makes a Christian what he or she is, but participation in the suffering of God in the life of the world." Let me repeat that. It is not some religious act which makes a Christian what he or she is, but participation in the suffering of God in the life of the world. Now, we Christians suffer for all manner of reasons. We share in the sickness, the disease, the accidents, the natural disasters, the wars, which are the lot of a humanity. This is part and parcel of what it means to be human in a not yet redeemed world. We are not immune as Christians to common human suffering. We also suffer sometimes because of our own foolishness, our mistakes, like when we eat unhealthy diets or ignore health warnings. Sometimes we suffer because we engage in culturally insensitive or even offensive methods of evangelization. Sometimes we suffer because of historical circumstances and prejudice. For example, whenever the United States goes and bombs a Muslim-majority country, the churches in those countries are attacked. Why? Because Muslims assume that all Americans are Christians, or that the Christian church is part of a Western conspiracy. But the suffering that Jesus is here speaking of is a suffering that his disciples freely choose. It's not something that just happens to them. It's a suffering that they choose out of self-denial. Now, sadly, in our Anglican Roman Catholic churches, this term self-denial has become so demeaned. What do we mean during the period of Lent when we speak of self-denial? We are told, well, if you like chocolates, give up chocolates. You like meat, give up eating meat for 40 days. You like alcohol, give up alcohol. Now, these may do wonders for your waistline, but they don't do a thing for your soul. This has nothing to do with Christian discipleship. It's just religious nonsense. Self-denial is saying no to ourselves in order to say yes to God and to others. It is to surrender ourselves to be instruments of God's purposes in the world. It is to say, I'm willing to risk violence or sickness or death itself in order to promote God's purposes of truth, of justice, of shalom. And this goes against all our parents' wishes for ourselves, isn't it? Those of you who are young. What do your parents want for you? To get good A-levels, to go to university, to get a degree, get what they call a good job, and a good job is one that pays well or that has high social prestige. And then you, quote, settle down, get married, have a family, ideally a boy and a girl, buy a car, buy a house. That is the conventional middle-class definition of success. And the tragedy is so many so-called born-again Christians have bought into that myth, that story of success. Now, Jesus is challenging that story. He's calling us to a different understanding of what it means to be successful, to be fruitful as his disciples. He's calling us to go the other way. So come with me in your imagination, and I'll tell you some stories. The year is 251 of the Christian era. The city is Carthage in North Africa. A measles epidemic has broken out in the city, and many are dying. The Christians in the city have just recovered from a recent torrid period of persecution under the Roman Emperor Decius. Their leaders have been killed, their homes burnt down, their businesses have been looted by mobs. And in this situation of great danger, when all the rich pagans are fleeing Carthage because of the epidemic, Bishop Cyprian preaches to his congregation. He urges them not to think about self-preservation, not even to be concerned about the survival of the church, but to love the very enemies of the church who've been persecuting them and are now suffering. This was an opportunity, he says, to show the love of Jesus by staying in the city, not running away, by nursing the sick Christians and sick pagans, and particularly the sick poor who have nowhere else to go. And a recent study by a church historian tells us that not only was the survival rate amongst those Christians who chose to stay much higher than the general survival rate from the measles epidemic, but the pagans who had been cared for by their Christian neighbors through this crisis were now more open to listening to the story that the Christians had to say about their God, because they saw here was a faith that worked, a faith that made a difference to people's lives, unlike their own pagan faiths. Now, that is the way the gospel normally goes out in a culture, in a society. And there are thousands of such stories I can tell you from church history, whether Eastern church history or Western church history. And even in our own country, think of all our Christian schools. Who founded them? People who came with very high academic qualifications, who turned their backs on academic careers in Britain, even political careers, to come and to be buried in the soil of Sri Lanka. And many of them were literally buried here. They risked illness, they risked ridicule, persecution, to share the gospel with our ancestors and to share the benefits of the gospel, education, the very privileges that they had enjoyed, they wanted to share with us. We know that during the dark years of the war, there were Christians who stayed in the north and the east. There were Christian clergy and pastors who accompanied their congregations into refugee camps, just being with them in the midst of suffering. And yet, sadly, so many middle-class Christian professionals from Colombo and Jaffna ran away. The moment there was any economic hardship, any threat to their lives, they ran away, and they're still running away. The moment there is any economic downturn, they're on a flight to Australia or Canada or Britain. Who is the God whom they worship? Not the God who becomes a grain of wheat, falls into the earth, and dies. I don't like to normally share about myself. There's so many preachers in this country who just talk about themselves, but Karin, my wife, has persuaded me that I should share something of my own story. Because this text, John 12:24, has been in a sense my life text. I left Sri Lanka at the age of 18, vowing never to come back. I found Sri Lanka intellectually and socially stifling, like a little village. I wanted to run away, never come back. But I grew as a Christian in England. I was troubled by reading so much about the God of justice in the pages of the Bible. I wondered, could I really live as a Christian, making the rich in the world richer and the powerful more powerful? So I was doing some postdoctoral research in a university in England, in engineering, and then I decided before I applied for any teaching or research positions in the West, I'd just take a year off, come back to Sri Lanka, find out what was happening here. I'd heard about a group of Christian students and young university graduates who were wanting guidance, some help in developing a Christian university ministry. So I decided that during this year I would join them and work with them, because I had benefited a lot from a Christian university ministry in England. And that's how I first met, some of you are here, Priyan Das, who was then a student, Prem Kumar. And during that year, as I traveled all around the island, I met with students who asked me all sorts of questions. Those in the north saying, can we join the Tamil Tigers and fight for our homeland, a separate state, because we are a separate nation, according to Lenin. There were JVP students in the south saying, why are Christians all capitalists? Can you join us in a revolution against this corrupt dictatorship? And I thought in all my years in England, I'd never wrestled with questions about nationalism and ethnicity and revolution or war. And then in the churches, there were people who said, you have gifts of teaching that we don't have here. And when I looked at the churches, I saw this wide division, this polarization. Many of our older churches were only talking of coexistence and religious dialogue. And then the new churches were only talking about preaching and healing, and the gospel they were preaching was a very narrow gospel. And I thought, the needs are so great. There is so much to do here. How can I go back and just live a safe, secure, comfortable life as a mediocre academic somewhere in America or Britain? And I wrestled with this text, John 12:24, right through that year. It haunted me. And then finally I remember just kneeling by my bedside and saying, Lord, I want my life to bear fruit. And if that means being buried here in the soil of Sri Lanka, turning my back on all my academic dreams and ambitions, I'm willing to become a nobody. And that 1 year has now become 37 years. And so when July 83 happened and everybody was running away, my family was telling me to run away, the decision had already been made. My father was deeply angry and upset by the decision. He didn't talk with me for several years. He who had boasted about me in my younger years once said to me, "I am ashamed to talk about you to my professional colleagues." He was a surgeon, and like most middle-class professionals in this country, social status mattered so much to him. And later he apologized to me, and we were reconciled to each other a few years before he died. Because he himself changed as he saw the fruit. As he met with some of those who came through the university ministry, he was impressed with their lives and the choices that they made. Now, I'm sharing this not because I want to draw attention to myself, but because I want to say to young people that when I urge you to go against your parents' wishes for yourself, I'm not asking you to do anything that I have not done myself. In this country, we are facing once again a dark future. And the question again is, are we who call ourselves Christians going to keep running away? Or are we going to stay in the darkness? Even if there is nothing that we now see we can do, just to stay in solidarity with those who suffer, who can never run away. The disciple community of Jesus is called to walk in the footsteps of its master, to be prepared to be buried in a world of cruelty, bigotry, poverty, violence, hopelessness, because this is the same world that crucified our master. And the church that seeks safety and security and prestige and worldly power, that church is no longer the church of the crucified Jesus. Let's spend a few moments in silence and let's respond to God in the quietness of our hearts. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Lord, hear the cry of our hearts. In the name of Jesus. Amen.